They called him a child emperor, too young, too weak, too inexperienced, but they didn't know what was coming. In 1444, when Mehmed first sat on the Ottoman throne, he was just 12 years old, a boy in a palace of men, surrounded by scheming viziers, wary generals, and foreign enemies waiting for the empire to crack. Nobody believed he could lead. Some didn't even try to hide their contempt, and so the reins of power were quietly pulled from his hands. A puppet sultan, a temporary stand-in while the real players moved in the shadows. But Mehmed was watching, learning, waiting. His first reign didn't last long. When war with Hungary threatened the empire's western front, the old lion Murad II, Mehmed's father, was summoned back to lead. Murad returned reluctantly at first, but decisively. The young sultan stepped aside, quietly, obediently, but not defeated. Mehmed knew he would return, and next time it would be on his terms. He went back to the city of Manisa, not to sulk, but to prepare. He devoured books on history, warfare, politics. He surrounded himself with scientists, scholars, engineers, and poets. He asked questions. He studied maps. He dreamed of Constantinople, that ancient jewel, that stubborn city of stone and faith that had defied Muslim conquerors for centuries. That city haunted him, obsessed him. Even as a teenager, Mehmed was determined. He would take Constantinople or die trying. Then in 1451 his moment came. Murad II died, and the now 19-year-old Mehmed returned to the throne. This time there would be no stepping down. This time he came prepared. But Constantinople was still the prize, and the problem. It was a city protected by ancient walls, proud emperors, and the last flicker of the Byzantine Empire. Western Europe still supported it. The Pope still dreamed of a Christian resurgence in the East, and Mehmed, he wanted to crush that dream forever. But first he had to silence his own court. Many advisors warned him against attacking Constantinople. Too risky, they said. Too costly. Better to wait. Better to build. But Mehmed refused to wait. He dismissed their fears. He didn't care that the city had survived for over 1,000 years. He didn't care about the curses, the prophecies, the legends. He saw a rotting empire behind thick walls, and he was ready to storm it. In secret, he started making preparations. First, he built a fortress, Rumeli Hizara, right on the Bosporus, directly across from another fortress his grandfather had built. Now he controlled the narrow waterway that separated Asia and Europe. He could cut off Constantinople's trade, starve it, isolate it. The Byzantines saw what he was doing. They protested. He ignored them. Then came the cannons. Mehmed hired a Hungarian engineer named Orban, a genius in siege weaponry. With Orban's help, he constructed a monster, a cannon so massive it took 60 oxen to pull it. It could launch a 600-pound stone ball over a mile. Constantinople's walls had never faced anything like this. The old world was about to meet new firepower. The siege began in April 1453. The Ottomans came with up to 80,000 men. The Byzantines had maybe 7,000 defenders, and that included foreign volunteers. Mehmed's army surrounded the city by land and sea. The mighty cannon roared. The walls shook. Day and night the drums of war thundered, but the defenders held. Week after week, they fought like men possessed. They believed God was with them, that Constantinople would never fall. But Mehmed had patience and plans. He ordered his ships to be dragged overland on greased logs around the Golden Horn. When they slipped back into the harbor behind the enemy lines, panic spread in the city. It was an impossible move. Bold, crazy, brilliant. It shattered morale. Then on May 29, 1453, after 53 brutal days, Mehmed gave the order. One final all-out assault. At dawn, his army surged forward, wave after wave. The defenders fought like demons. Blood soaked the stones. Arrows darkened the sky. But the walls had cracked. The cannon had done its work. A gate fell. Ottoman troops poured in. The defenders collapsed. Emperor Constantine V died sword in hand. The city was lost. At 21 years old, Mehmed walked into Constantinople, now Istanbul, and knelt to pray in the great church of Hagia Sophia. He ordered it converted into a mosque. He didn't burn the city. He didn't destroy it. He claimed it, preserved it, transformed it. He declared himself Kaiser I Rum, Caesar of Rome, because now he ruled the city that had once ruled the world. And so the boy who had once been laughed at became Mehmed the Conqueror, Sultan of the Ottomans, breaker of empires, and the world would never be the same. The fall of Constantinople was not the end of a campaign. It was the beginning of an empire. The world looked on in shock. Europe trembled. The Pope wept. Christian kings called it the end of an age. But for Mehmed, this was only chapter 1. With the capital now in his hands, he got to work. Fast. He rebuilt the city, reorganized it, repopulated it. He invited Jews, Christians, and Muslims from across the empire to come live in his new imperial capital. He needed architects, merchants, clerics, soldiers, farmers, anyone willing to help build his dream, a multicultural empire where order flowed from his will, not old traditions. He established the millet system, allowing religious communities to govern themselves under their own laws, as long as they pledged loyalty to the Sultan. This wasn't just tolerance, it was strategy. Control people by letting them think they're free. Keep the peace, keep the taxes flowing. Mehmed was not just a conqueror with a sword, he was a master chess player, always 10 steps ahead. But he wasn't done fighting. After taking Constantinople, Mehmed set his sights on the rest of the Byzantine holdouts, the Empire of Trebizond in the northeast and the Despotate of the Morea in the south. Both still claimed to be part of the old Christian empire. That offended him. There could be no rivals to his rule. In the years that followed, he crushed them both. He didn't stop at the Byzantines. He went after the Serbians, who had long defied Ottoman power in the Balkans. He conquered their strongholds, absorbed their nobility, made the Serbian princes into his vassals, then quietly replaced them with Ottoman administrators. Slowly, patiently, completely. He moved westward into Albania, where he met fierce resistance from a warrior named Skanderbeg, a Christian commander who became a symbol of rebellion across Europe. For years, Skanderbeg frustrated Mehmed's armies, using mountain passes, guerrilla tactics, and local support. Mehmed sent thousands of troops, built new fortresses, offered rewards for betrayal. Skanderbeg survived them all, but only just. When Skanderbeg died in 1468, Albanian resistance crumbled. To the east, Mehmed turned his gaze to the Black Sea. He conquered the Genoese colonies there, cities like Amasra and Sinop. He attacked the Karamanids in Anatolia, who had once been loyal, but now resisted Ottoman control. He defeated them too. Every year, more banners fell, more castles turned, more enemies surrendered or died. And yet it wasn't always brute force. Mehmed used diplomacy like a dagger. He bribed allies, sent gifts to Italian city-states, tricked rival princes into trusting him, then took their cities when they looked away. He wasn't cruel for fun. He was ruthless, with purpose. But he wasn't just building an empire on the outside. He was shaping its soul from within. He brought scholars from across the Islamic world to his court, from Persia, Egypt, Arabia. He read Greek philosophy, debated theology with clerics, sponsored translations of science and mathematics. His court was filled with painters, poets, calligraphers, and architects. He wanted Istanbul to be not just a capital of war, but a beacon of culture, a second Rome, a city that would outshine all others. And his palace in Topkapi became a symbol of that dream. Topkapi wasn't just a royal residence. It was the nerve center of the empire. A maze of courtyards, chambers, gardens, and pavilions. Inside, decisions were made that shaped continents. Ambassadors were received, alliances formed, intrigues whispered. At the heart of it all was Mehmed, calm, focused, often silent, but always watching. He wore robes of silk, but his mind was steel. He established the Dev-Shirme system with brutal efficiency, taking Christian boys from the Balkans, converting them to Islam, and training them to be elite soldiers or administrators. Some called it slavery. Others called it opportunity. Many of these boys became powerful men, grand viziers, generals, even admirals. They owed everything to Mehmed, and he made sure they never forgot it. His army became a machine, disciplined, loyal, and feared. The Janissaries, his elite troops, marched in perfect rows, clad in white robes and tall hats, silent and deadly. His navy grew stronger each year, patrolling the Mediterranean, raiding enemy coasts, challenging even Venice on the seas. And then there was Otranto. In 1480, at the height of his power, Mehmed launched a stunning campaign. He sent a fleet across the Adriatic and captured the city of Otranto in southern Italy. His troops marched ashore. They built fortresses, executed resistance leaders, planted the crescent flag on Christian soil. The message was clear. Rome itself was in his sights. Panic spread across Europe. The Pope called for a new crusade. Kings scrambled to form coalitions. Mehmed, the man they had once dismissed as a boy sultan, was now threatening the heart of Christendom. But then suddenly it all stopped. In May of 1481, as Mehmed prepared for what many believed was a final campaign, perhaps against Venice, perhaps against Rhodes or even Rome, he fell ill. His body swelled. His strength faded. Rumors swirled of poisoning, assassination, treachery. No one knows for sure. By the end of the month, Mehmed was dead. His death was kept secret at first. Even his closest commanders didn't believe it. When the truth came out, Istanbul erupted in chaos. Factions within the court scrambled to secure the succession. His son Bayezid eventually took the throne, but the scars of that transition never fully healed. And so ended the life of one of history's most determined conquerors. But his legacy never died. He didn't just expand the Ottoman Empire. He reshaped it. He built institutions that would endure for centuries. He made Istanbul a capital of both power and culture. He shattered the old world and built a new one in its place. He was not just Mehmed. He was Fatih, the Conqueror, and his shadow still stretches across history. After Mehmed's death, the world held its breath. The man who had crushed Constantinople, subdued the Balkans, and shaken Europe had vanished, and no one knew what would come next. Power in the Ottoman court was a dangerous thing. When the Sultan dies, the empire doesn't stop. It just bleeds quietly until someone new takes the throne. Behind the palace walls, messengers raced. Grand viziers chose sides. Military commanders pledged loyalty, not always to the same heir. Two sons remained, Bayezid and Cem, one in the capital, one in the provinces, both ready to claim the empire their father had built. The conflict was swift and brutal. Bayezid, the elder son, had more support among the Janissaries and the ulama, the religious scholars. Cem, charismatic and ambitious, had the backing of parts of Anatolia. They clashed in a bitter civil war. Cem was defeated, but he didn't vanish. He fled west, the first to Cairo, then Rhodes, and finally into the hands of European powers. What followed was a strange chapter in Ottoman and European history. The Ottomans paid Christian monarchs to keep Cem in captivity, afraid he would return and spark rebellion. For years, the Christian kings used him as a political bargaining chip. He was paraded like a trophy, a Turkish prince held hostage by the very world his father had once terrorized. But Mehmed's empire didn't fall apart. Bayezid II, his son, ruled with caution. He focused more on stability than conquest. He preserved his father's reforms, maintained the army, strengthened the bureaucracy. He sent fleets to rescue expelled Jews from Spain and resettle them in Ottoman lands, another echo of Mehmed's multicultural vision. But something else began to change after Mehmed's death. The image of the Sultan, the idea of the ruler as more than just a king, grew larger. Mehmed had created a cult of authority. He wasn't just a ruler. He was the Ghazi, the sword of Islam, the inheritor of Rome, the embodiment of destiny. Later, sultans inherited that image. They didn't just rule the empire. They performed power, wore it, lived it. You can see Mehmed's ghost in the architecture that came after him. The imperial mosques grew bigger, more elaborate, built not just for prayer, but for awe. You can feel him in the laws, where sultanic decrees began to rival religious rulings. You can trace him in the very language of the empire, as Persian court poetry blended with Turkish governance and Arab theology. An empire made from many tongues, many peoples, all fused into one by a man who had stared down the old world and broken it open. But the legacy of conquest didn't always bring peace. In the century after Mehmed's death, the Ottomans surged forward again, under sultans like Selim the Grim and Suleiman the Magnificent. They conquered Egypt, crushed the Safavids in Persia, took Hungary, reached the gates of Vienna. But those victories all grew from the foundation Mehmed built, his policies, his armies, his vision. And the world never forgot Constantinople. In the West, the fall of the city became myth, pain, a symbol of Christian decline and Islamic power. Painters in Italy depicted the walls crumbling under cannon fire. Poets in Germany wrote laments for the loss of Rome's last outpost. Popes called for revenge, crusades, redemption, but nothing came. The city didn't just survive, it flourished. Constantinople became Istanbul, not destroyed but transformed. Churches became mosques, markets bustled, art flourished. The scars of the siege became foundations for a new world. A world where East met West, not just in battle, but in trade, in thought, in architecture and science. And somewhere in the center of it all, in the shadows of Topkapi, in the great halls of Hagia Sophia, in the calligraphy on every dome and the silence of every tomb, was the presence of Mehmed. He wasn't a typical sultan. He didn't fit the mold. Some said he was too cold, others too curious, too daring, too ambitious. But he was always deliberate, always measured, always chasing something beyond ordinary conquest. He wanted to rule an empire that rivaled Alexander's, Caesar's, and the caliphs. But more than that, he wanted to reshape the world's idea of who held power, who deserved it, who could write history, and then to take the pen and write it himself. Even centuries later, when nationalist movements swept the globe and empires crumbled, Mehmed remained a symbol. To some, he was a hero of Islam. To others, a tyrant of lost Christendom. To the Turkish Republic, he became a national icon. His name on schools, his statue on squares, his shadow still draped across the Bosporus. And it wasn't just what he did, it was when he did it. He rose during a time of uncertainty, when the medieval world was dying and the modern world had not yet begun. The printing press was still new. Columbus had not yet crossed the Atlantic. The Renaissance was blooming in Italy. Gunpowder was changing warfare. New ideas were cracking open old beliefs. The world was shifting, and Mehmed somehow saw the change before others did. He used old tools, swords, diplomacy, faith, but for a new kind of empire. One that didn't just conquer territory but captured imagination, that didn't just expand borders but redrew them completely. In the centuries that followed, many tried to imitate him. Some came close. None quite matched his balance of force and vision, because it wasn't just that Mehmed took Constantinople, it was that he knew what to do with it once it was his. He made it a symbol, a message, a declaration to the world. That empires end but others rise. That no wall is too high, no city too holy, no legacy too sacred to be rewritten, and that history doesn't belong to those who wait. It belongs to those who take it. In the decades that followed Mehmed's conquest, the old powers of Europe couldn't stop whispering about him. The fall of Constantinople wasn't just a historical event. It was a trauma, a cultural fracture, a psychological earthquake that sent waves through every throne room in Europe. Kings, bishops, and generals began to ask dangerous questions. If Constantinople could fall, what else might collapse? In Italian city-states, merchants who once traded freely with Byzantium scrambled to reroute their goods. Genoese bankers cursed their fortunes. Venetian diplomats pivoted from allies of the old empire to uneasy business partners with the Ottomans. In Rome, the papacy went into full panic mode. What if the Turks kept pushing? What if Rome itself became the next Constantinople? But Mehmed had no interest in immediate all-out war with the West. Not yet. His genius lay in patience as much as ambition. He didn't just charge into Europe with bloodlust. He waited, studied, positioned his chessboard piece by piece. While Europe imagined hordes of screaming horsemen, Mehmed sent scholars to study fortresses. He invited Italian architects to design his new capital. He brought in mathematicians, poets, astronomers, anyone who could help him understand the strengths and weaknesses of the world outside. He built libraries, observatories, colleges, not because he loved books, but because knowledge was power, and power built empires. He knew how to wield religion too, not as a fanatic but as a weapon of legitimacy. In the Islamic world, he didn't just claim victory over infidels. He called himself Kaiser-i-Rum, Caesar of Rome, a Muslim emperor claiming the mantle of Eastern Rome. It wasn't just bold, it was revolutionary. It reframed centuries of rivalry between Christian and Muslim empires. To his own subjects, Mehmed became something else, a shapeshifter. To Muslim peasants in Anatolia, he was the Ghazi warrior who fought for Islam. To Orthodox Christians in former Byzantine lands, he was the protector who preserved their churches and let their patriarch lead his people under Ottoman rule. To Jews fleeing persecution in Europe, he was a beacon of tolerance. And to his enemies, he was a riddle wrapped in steel. But there was still more to conquer. After Constantinople, Mehmed turned east, crushing rival Turkish beyliks that once mocked the Ottomans as upstarts. He annexed Trebizond, the last remnant of the Byzantine world, then Serbia, Bosnia, Wallachia, Albania. The Balkans turned red with resistance, but most fell eventually, not just from sword and cannon, but from clever politics. The Sultan often spared nobles who surrendered early, incorporating them into his administration. Others were offered conversion or partnership, or gold, or marriage alliances. It was never just brute force. It was seduction, diplomacy, divide and conquer. But not everyone bowed. One man in particular refused. Vlad III Dracula, the infamous Vlad the Impaler, Prince of Wallachia, had once been a hostage in the Ottoman court, a pawn held by Mehmed's father to keep his family in line. Mehmed and Vlad had known each other as boys, both shaped by violence, both hungry for power. But while Mehmed became a tactician of empire, Vlad embraced fear. He built his kingdom on terror. Forests of impaled corpses warned enemies to turn back. He fought the Ottomans with unrelenting savagery, and for a time, he held them off. Their final confrontation was the stuff of nightmares. As Mehmed's armies advanced into Wallachia, they found thousands of their comrades skewered on stakes, stretching for miles, a grotesque psychological assault. But Mehmed did not retreat. He marched on, burned Vlad's capital, forced him to flee. The war with Dracula wasn't the largest campaign of Mehmed's life, but it symbolized something deeper, the clash between two visions of rule, one of calculated domination, the other of raw, unfiltered cruelty. And in the end, Mehmed won. He always did. Even when he lost battles, he won wars. Because he thought in centuries, not campaigns, in civilization, not just victory. Every new province became part of a wider network, taxed, catalogued, connected by roads and couriers. His empire was not just territorial, it was administrative, strategic, and increasingly centralized under his authority. He stripped away the last vestiges of independence from feudal Turkish warlords. Their lands became state property. The bureaucracy swelled. Merit replaced aristocracy, at least on the surface. But there was another side to Mehmed, one darker, colder. He was ruthless with threats, even within his own bloodline. One of the most infamous acts of his reign came not on the battlefield, but in the quiet of the palace, the legal sanctioning of fratricide. Mehmed issued a law silent but seismic, declaring that when a new sultan rose to power, he had the right to execute his brothers to prevent civil war. It wasn't an invention. Ottoman princes had always been rivals, but now it was codified, institutionalized, the law of the land. It was a monstrous idea, but also brutally logical, and it worked for centuries. Later sultans would begin their reigns by executing their siblings, children, teenagers, infants, smothered in silence so the empire could live in peace. A sacrifice of blood for the sake of stability. This is the kind of empire Mehmed left behind, one of breathtaking ambition and breathtaking cruelty. He reimagined what it meant to be a ruler, not just of a kingdom, but of a world. He absorbed Byzantine bureaucracy, Islamic legalism, Turkish tribalism, and European diplomacy into one terrifyingly effective system. He didn't just inherit an empire, he engineered one. By the time of his death in 1481, Mehmed's territory stretched across 3 continents, from the Danube to the Euphrates, from the Black Sea to the Aegean. His enemies were exhausted, his allies were wary, his people fearful, proud, and bewildered all at once. He died suddenly, perhaps poisoned, while planning a new campaign. No one knows for sure where he was going. Some say it was Italy, others believe he was preparing to attack the Mamluks in Egypt. One thing is certain, he wasn't done. But death at last did what no army could. It stopped Mehmed. And yet even in death he remained dangerous. When Mehmed died in 1481, the empire fell into a nervous silence. Whispers echoed through the palace corridors. The Sultan was gone. But his presence still weighed on the city like thunder that hadn't yet cracked. His sudden death raised more questions than answers. Had he been poisoned? If so, by whom? Was it his advisors, his son? An enemy within the harem? No one dared say it aloud, but everyone wondered. His body was buried in a mausoleum just outside the Fatih Mosque, in the heart of the city he had stolen from history. The marble walls glistened. The air smelled of incense and wet stone. Crowds wept and knelt. Others stayed far away, either out of fear or quiet relief. For even in death Mehmed cast a long shadow, but the real weight now fell on his successors. His eldest surviving son, Bayezid II, took the throne. But Mehmed's empire was not easy to inherit. It was too large, too new, too complex, and it had been forged in the vision of a man who trusted almost no one, even his own sons. Bayezid had barely ascended when he received a delivery, a sealed box. Inside, a single object, his brother's severed head. It was sent to him by supporters after a brutal struggle for succession. This wasn't an accident. It was a message. The age of mercy was over. Mehmed had set the rules of empire, and those rules were written in blood. Bayezid would rule for decades, and his reign would be more peaceful, more religious, more introspective. But he would never match the sheer force of his father. Few ever could. Because Mehmed wasn't just a conqueror of cities. He was a conqueror of systems. He had changed what it meant to be Ottoman. Before him, the empire was a regional power, strong, growing, but still uncertain. After him, it was an imperial machine, organized, aggressive, unstoppable. He had reshaped law, language, religion, architecture, and education. He brought in scholars from Persia, engineers from Hungary, and translators from Italy. His court spoke Turkish, Arabic, Greek, and Latin. He wanted the world's knowledge, not just to learn from it, but to dominate it. He also rebuilt Constantinople, now Istanbul, not just as a symbol of Ottoman triumph, but as a living, breathing empire in miniature. He made it the capital of the world, or at least tried. Churches were converted to mosques, yes, but also preserved, modified, hybridized. New neighborhoods sprouted. Armenian craftsmen, Jewish merchants, Slavic scribes, they all found a place in Mehmed's city. Not always by choice, but once there, they contributed to something larger than themselves. This wasn't tolerance, it was strategy. Mehmed didn't need everyone to agree with him. He just needed everyone to obey. But he also understood symbolism. He crowned himself Caesar of Rome for a reason. It wasn't a gimmick, it was a signal. To Orthodox Christians, he was not a barbarian. He was the successor to Constantine. To the Muslim world, he was the sword of Islam. To Europe, he was the specter of empire rising from the east. And the truth is, Europe never really recovered. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of an era. The Middle Ages collapsed under its weight. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Exploration, all of it happened in part because the West was scrambling to adapt to a world Mehmed had redefined. With the trade routes to the east now in Ottoman hands, European powers rushed to find sea routes to Asia. This led to the voyages of Columbus and da Gama. Entire continents were discovered because a young Ottoman sultan had done the unthinkable. He had erased the Byzantine buffer and planted a crescent moon where the cross once stood. In a way, Mehmed didn't just conquer a city. He kicked history into fast forward. Even centuries later, his influence rippled outward. Napoleon would call Constantinople the capital of the world. Hitler would study Mehmed's consolidation of power. Mussolini admired his force of will. Writers, artists, generals, they all circled around this one truth. Mehmed the Conqueror was more than a man. He was a turning point. But his legacy was complicated. He was a builder and a destroyer, a patron of poets and an architect of massacres, a scholar of languages and an enforcer of silence. He loved history and rewrote it. To many Muslims, he was a hero, the Ghazi king who fulfilled prophecy and brought glory to the faith. To Orthodox Christians, he was a paradox, the invader who destroyed their empire but preserved their church. To Western Europe, he was a threat, an enigma, a villain dressed in silk robes and military genius. His court advisors once said he never smiled. Not because he was cruel, but because he saw things others didn't. He saw the fragility of power, the betrayal of allies, the cost of greatness, and he accepted it all. That's what made him different. He didn't seek fame, he assumed it. He didn't fear death, he calculated it. He didn't dream of empire, he became one. Mehmed II, the man who broke Constantinople, reshaped East and West and forged a dynasty that would last over 400 years. He died in 1481, but the empire he built didn't crumble until 1922, nearly half a millennium later. And even then, the world he created never really disappeared. It lingers in stone and scripture, in the skyline of Istanbul, in the echoes of East and West still grappling for control. Because once a conqueror like Mehmed steps onto the world stage, the stage is never the same again. Even after his death, Mehmed the Conqueror refused to fade. His fingerprints remained everywhere, in the shape of mosques, the script of laws, the scars of conquest. His successors didn't just rule the Ottoman Empire, they inherited Mehmed's vision, his burdens and his reputation, and every one of them had to deal with the same question. How do you rule an empire built by a man like that? Some tried to imitate him, others tried to escape his shadow, but none could ignore it. Bayezid Toun, his son, took the throne in a fragile peace. He was more pious, more scholarly, less bloodthirsty. But his reign was consumed by paranoia, not of enemies abroad, but of brothers at home. Mehmed had made fratricide a legal tool of succession, and now that tool had teeth. The empire became a battlefield of whispers and executions. Every prince was a potential threat. Every loyal advisor could be a traitor in disguise. In a way, Mehmed had created a system so strong it poisoned itself. Unity came through fear. Stability came through blood. But his model worked. The empire continued to grow, not just in size but in sophistication. Under Mehmed, Istanbul had become a center of knowledge. The medrese schools multiplied. Legal codes were copied, debated, and refined. Astronomy, theology, military science. They weren't just studied, they were weaponized. And other sultans took notice. Selim the Grim, who ruled decades later, modeled himself after Mehmed in brutality and ambition. He expanded the empire further into the Islamic heartlands, conquering Egypt, the Levant, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. He didn't just want territory, he wanted legitimacy. By taking the caliphate and moving it to Istanbul, he made the Ottomans not just sultans, but leaders of the Islamic world. That move was straight out of Mehmed's playbook. Conquer the heart, control the story. And then came Suleiman, known in the West as the Magnificent. He took Mehmed's foundation and built a palace on top of it. Under Suleiman, the Ottoman Empire reached its cultural and political golden age. Poets sang, architects sculpted the skyline, laws were written that would endure for centuries. But even Suleiman, with all his power and beauty, didn't erase Mehmed's ghost. He still ruled from the city Mehmed had taken. He still issued orders from the throne Mehmed had carved. His empire still marched on roads Mehmed had paved with bodies and strategy. You can't build a future without walking through the past. And the past belonged to the conqueror. But legacy is a double-edged sword, because for all of Mehmed's genius, his methods came with a cost. His obsession with centralization made rebellion inevitable. His use of religious flexibility bred resentment. His treatment of Christians and Jews, though more tolerant than his European counterparts, was still hierarchical, still manipulative. His empire was built to function, not to liberate. And as centuries passed, the empire he founded began to crack. The Janissaries, his elite corps of converted Christian soldiers, grew too powerful, too political. The sultans became isolated behind curtains and palace walls. Intrigue replaced vision. Decay set in not from invasion, but from within. And yet even as the Ottomans declined, they still held a certain mythic power, because they were still Mehmed's empire. He had written their DNA. Even the 19th century reformers who tried to modernize the state invoked his name, not to honor him but to awaken him. They believed if they could just channel Mehmed's clarity, his drive, his purpose, the empire might rise again. But it never quite did. In 1922, the last Ottoman sultan was forced into exile. A republic was born from the ruins, the modern nation of Turkey, led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. And what did Atatürk do? He broke with the Ottoman past. He abolished the sultanate. He secularized the state. He Latinized the script. He wanted to move forward, westward, modern, nationalist. But even Atatürk couldn't fully escape Mehmed's legacy. He still ruled from Istanbul, still looked out over the Bosphorus, still walked the same city streets that Mehmed had once marched through as a 21-year-old conqueror with the fate of empires in his hands. History lingers, power echoes, and Mehmed had created something that could not be undone, only transformed. Today you can walk through Istanbul and feel him, not just in the massive dome of Hagia Sophia or the stone arches of the Topkapi Palace, not just in the books or the minarets or the legends whispered by tour guides. You feel him in the tension, the pull between East and West, the friction between religion and reason, the beauty of grandeur built on bones, because that's what Mehmed understood better than anyone. That history isn't a story, it's a structure. And he didn't just tell a story, he built one. One stone at a time, one law at a time, one death at a time. So when we talk about Mehmed the Conqueror, we're not just talking about a boy who took a city. We're talking about a mind that redesigned an entire world. And the world still hasn't caught up. Time changes everything. Names, places, empires. But it doesn't erase legends. And Mehmed the Conqueror didn't just leave behind stone and parchment. He left behind an image, one that refuses to die. His story has been reimagined again and again, on coins, in schoolbooks, in coffeehouse poems, in propaganda. To some, he was a visionary ruler ahead of his time. To others, a cold and ruthless killer. But everyone agrees on one thing. He was unforgettable. In Turkish history, Mehmed is lionized. He's the boy genius who outsmarted emperors and generals, the Muslim hero who brought the Byzantine Empire to its knees. He's not just celebrated in textbooks, he's part of the national identity. In Istanbul, you see his name on bridges, streets, mosques. Schools teach his campaigns like scripture. Artists paint him wrapped in shadows and crimson robes, staring down the viewer like he still knows something you don't. Politicians invoke his name when they want to seem strong, when they want to remind people that this land was conquered with purpose. Modern leaders have even drawn direct comparisons to him, carefully crafting speeches around Ottoman nostalgia. It's not just about glory, it's about control. Because Mehmed wasn't just a conqueror. He was an architect of empire, a symbol of order built on willpower and blood. But outside of Turkey, his image shifts. In Europe, especially during the Renaissance and Enlightenment, Mehmed was feared, then misunderstood, then romanticized. Western historians struggled to place him. He was too educated to be a barbarian, too calculating to be dismissed as a fanatic. They called him the Grand Turk, the shadow looming over Christendom. Artists in Venice painted him as a seductive monster, part man, part myth. Later, some even admired him, as the Eastern Caesar, the mirror of Alexander or Julius. Writers like Voltaire and Gibbon studied him, not with hatred, but with uneasy respect. They couldn't deny his achievements. His conquest of Constantinople was seen as the end of the Middle Ages, one man resetting the timeline. Even now, documentaries and films portray Mehmed in stark contrasts, either the ruthless sword of Islam or the enlightened philosopher king. Rarely both. But the truth is, he was both. And that duality is what makes him so dangerous to forget. And then there's the Islamic world. In many Arab and South Asian circles, Mehmed is admired not just for his military genius, but for fulfilling a prophecy. According to some interpretations of Hadith, the Prophet Muhammad foretold that a man would conquer Constantinople in the name of Islam. For centuries, various Muslim rulers tried and failed, but Mehmed succeeded. Because of this, he's remembered as Fatih Sultan Mehmed, Mehmed the Opener. the one who opened the gates of the Second Rome. This spiritual legacy gives him a special place in the collective Muslim memory, not just as a conqueror, but as a symbol of divine favor. Sermons have cited him. Scholars have debated his policies. Youth movements have used his name to inspire political or religious activism. But the Mehmed they remember isn't always the one who lived. They don't always talk about how he allied with Christian mercenaries, or how he protected Jewish refugees, or how he read ancient Greek philosophy and collected Roman busts, or how he employed European architects and turned his court into a mosaic of languages and loyalties, because the real Mehmed doesn't fit cleanly into anyone's box. He was a product of many worlds, born on the fault line of civilizations, raised by tutors from both the East and West, trained in Quranic scripture and Renaissance humanism, fluent in Arabic, Persian, Turkish, Greek, Latin, and Serbian. He was in every sense a child of contradiction. And maybe that's why he still resonates. In a world that keeps drawing lines between faith and reason, East and West, power and justice, Mehmed blurs them. He lived in the in-between, and he ruled from it. He reminds us that greatness often comes at a cost, that the men who shape history are rarely gentle and rarely simple. But also that vision matters. That one man obsessed with a dream can change the course of empires, can bend cities to his will, can transform a collapsing dynasty into a global power, and leave behind a city that still pulses with his ambition 5 centuries later. Because you don't need to believe in Mehmed, you just have to look around. He's there, in the minarets that pierce the sky, in the call to prayer that echoes over the Bosphorus, in the marble silence of Hagia Sophia. The world he built still breathes, and whether we call it empire, republic, or memory, it started with him. By the late 1470s, Mehmed was no longer the young boy king who had to prove himself. He had already transformed a medieval sultanate into a centralized, multi-ethnic empire. He had taken Constantinople, crushed the last flickers of Byzantine resistance, and extended Ottoman rule across the Balkans, the Aegean, Anatolia, and parts of the Black Sea coast. His enemies feared him, his allies didn't trust him, and his people called him Fatih, the conqueror. But Mehmed wasn't done. Despite already controlling a realm that spanned thousands of miles and cultures, he still saw gaps on the map. To him, Sicily and Italy were unfinished business. So was Venice. So were the rival Turkic tribes in the east. The idea of empire never stopped expanding in his head. He was constantly commissioning new ships, drawing up new campaigns, reorganizing the army, hiring new spies, scholars, translators. He barely slept. In 1480, he launched a campaign to take Rhodes from the Knights of St. John. It failed, but the same year, his troops landed in Otranto, southern Italy. It wasn't just a raid, it was a signal. Mehmed was preparing to cross into the heart of Europe, just as Hannibal once had, just as Caesar had done in reverse. The Pope himself began organizing a counter-crusade, terrified that the man who ended Byzantium was now coming for Rome. But Mehmed would never make it to Italy. In early 1481, he began preparing another major campaign. He didn't tell his generals exactly where. Some think it was to finish off the Mamluks in Egypt. Others believe he was going back to Italy. A few whispered it was something stranger. Some say even a pilgrimage, a shift, a change of heart. But before he could act, something unexpected happened. On May 3, 1481, Mehmed the Conqueror suddenly fell ill near the town of Gebze, while en route to launch his new military expedition. Within days, he was dead. He was only 49 years old, a man who had survived dozens of battles, sieges, assassins, court intrigues, and the crushing pressure of rule since childhood, died mysteriously in his camp. And that mystery has never gone away, because no one could explain what exactly happened. One day he was organizing logistics, the next he was writhing in pain. Some chroniclers described violent vomiting, others mentioned swelling, discoloration, and spasms. His physicians were baffled. His entourage went silent. Then the rumors exploded. Was Mehmed poisoned? It wouldn't have been the first time someone in his court tried. The Ottoman palace was a viper pit of ambition. Some suspected his son Bayezid, who wanted to claim the throne quickly before his half-brother Cem could react. Others believed his Grand Vizier, Kahramani Mehmed Pasha, had grown too powerful and saw the Sultan as a threat to his influence. Then there were foreign agents. Venetian records hinted at a darker possibility, that Mehmed was poisoned by an Italian doctor on the Venetian payroll. A quiet act of war, a long-awaited revenge. Mehmed had terrorized Italian trade routes, burned Venetian possessions in the Aegean, and threatened the Pope himself. Maybe the West had finally found a way to stop him, not with armies, but with arsenic. No one was ever charged. No one confessed. His doctors were executed, perhaps to hide the truth, or perhaps because someone needed a scapegoat. The poison theory remains, to this day, one of the most debated questions in Ottoman history. But what's undeniable is that Mehmed's death created a vacuum. When he died, the empire he built almost splintered. His sons, Bayezid and Cem, plunged into a brutal civil war. Cem lost, fled to Europe, and was held hostage by the Pope for ransom, used as a bargaining chip against the Ottomans. Bayezid, now Sultan, took power, but lacked his father's strategic genius. The momentum of Mehmed's conquest slowed. For a while the empire treaded water. And yet, even in death, Mehmed loomed large. His tomb in Istanbul became a place of pilgrimage. His laws, decrees, and administrative reforms outlasted his successors. His vision of an empire that bridged East and West shaped centuries of Ottoman governance. His conquest of Constantinople became not just a historical moment, but a foundational myth. Even his personal quirks became legends. That he never smiled, that he kept a secret map of every city he planned to conquer, that he once buried a scholar alive for mocking his Greek translation, that he walked barefoot through Hagia Sophia in silence the day he took it. And above all, that he saw himself as both Caesar and Caliph, because Mehmed believed he was more than just a ruler. He believed he had inherited the legacy of the Roman emperors, that he had absorbed not only Constantinople's walls and palaces, but its divine right to rule. It was more than vanity, it was identity. He styled himself Kaiseri Rum, Caesar of Rome, not as a metaphor but as a claim. In his court he hosted Christian scholars and debated theology. He read Aristotle and Plato, but also Persian poetry and Islamic jurisprudence. He could recite epic poems and argue about architecture. He dreamed of a universal empire, not just through conquest, but through culture. And when you walk through Istanbul today, past the domes, towers, mosques, aqueducts, you see Mehmed's fingerprints everywhere. Not just in the skyline, but in the very identity of the city. He didn't just take Constantinople, he made it his. A city reborn, a world reordered. The boy who was mocked, exiled, doubted, and betrayed became the man who redrew maps, silenced empires, and turned his enemies into dust. And even now, centuries later, you can't tell the story of the modern world without him, because Mehmed didn't just conquer a city, he conquered history.